Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here and welcome back to the railway. I've heard it said that Great Western locomotives are boring, samey and monotonous, and I can understand why some people think that to an extent, but ultimately I do not agree, and in this video I'm going to explain why. So why are some people a bit tired of Great Western locomotives? I think that's quite a complicated question, but I've got three more simple answers for you. First of all, livery. If a Great Western loco is not painted into Great Western black, then chances are it's going to appear in Great Western green. And I think the green is lovely, but maybe it's not quite as exciting as other colours and other liveries. Also, it's very similar to BR green, and of course, post-nationalisation, an awful lot of locos were painted into BR green, and maybe people are just tired of seeing that. There's certainly a lot of locos in that livery in model form. Second of all, preservation. There are an awful lot of Great Western locomotives under preservation, and that's great, but some people are quite tired of that. I've heard them say, it's a lot of Great Western, isn't there? I wish there was more LNER or LMS or Southern locos preserved, but most of them are Great Western. Fair enough, but there's not a lot I can do about those first two things in this video. But the third reason why I think people think that Great Western locos are a bit monotonous is because of the 460 wheel configuration. There are a lot of Great Western 460s about, and again, I think it's a very stylish wheel configuration, but it's not particularly exciting, and it leads to a lack of variety perhaps in Great Western locos. So for this video, I have made a radical decision. I'm going to try and persuade you that Great Western locos are interesting, varied and elegant without the use of a single Great Western 460 loco. You might say it can't be done, you might say such a thing is impossible, but it is possible and I'm going to dare to attempt it. So let's start off with a pre-grouping locomotive, because if you want to persuade somebody that a loco is handsome, you'll have an easier job if it's pre-grouping, and the Great Western of course did exist before the grouping, so that's a clever way for me to get in some more interesting locos. So today's first loco is this. It's from 1894 and it's known as the Dean Single. And this loco is not a victim of any of the shortcomings I've just described. It is in a Great Western green, but as you can see the livery has been embellished by shiny metalwork and chrome handrails and such. It is not preserved. There is a kind of replica out there, but it's not a proper one, so you got that. And clearly this is not a 460, it is a single wheeler, which is always fascinating. I love single wheelers. There's very few of these available in model form, and yet here we have one of them from the Great Western. Also known as the Achilles class, the Dean Single was built by William Dean for passenger work between 1891 and 1899. Incredibly, the first 8 members of the class were 222 locomotives designed for broad gauge, but by 1892 the standard gauge design became the norm, and from then on they were fitted with even larger boilers despite the smaller gauge, hence the necessity of the additional leading wheels. An impressive 80 Deans were built in total, but by the end of the 1910s the class was fast becoming outdated. Many modifications, improvements and even a complete rebuild were proposed, but all of these were deemed impractical. By the end of 1916, every member of the class had been withdrawn with no survivors. A replica does exist, but contrary to popular misconception, the engine is purely static, never functional, and only the visible parts of the wheels actually exist. And I chose the Dean Single because it really is as much of a departure from the signature 460s of the Great Western as you can possibly get. It's a real classic example of Victorian elegance, and it's a loco that I just love. This is the latest version of it from Hornby in the Triang Remembered set. So it is a very old model, but it's been decorated to modern standards, which really helps you imagine what a beautiful machine this must have been. Look at the shiny brasswork on here, really makes the loco stand out, and this model doesn't really show it, but you've also got the copperwork too, which would have looked absolutely marvellous. Obviously the proportions of the loco are interesting as well, because you have got the large single driver on the side, which is very different to basically every other loco we're going to see today, which gives the whole loco really a very interesting appearance. One thing that's not talked about that much are the Great Western tenders, but I do think these are incredibly elegant, and because this is a pre-grouping loco and not from a later grouping era, this looks kind of old-fashioned in its design. Very, very elegant lines. I love the curves of the upper body. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous tender. Even though this model is decades old, it's still lovely to look at. And this loco looks lovely static, but it looks even better when it's up and running. So let's get it down onto the track with some early Great Western coaches, and let me show you it in action. So this model dates back quite a few years, so it doesn't have a particularly modern or refined mechanism, but it still gives you a rough idea of how marvellous this would have looked as it runs along. No coupling rods to see, no valve gear outside, so it kind of just snakes along as if by magic. And of course, if you think of what the Victorians must have thought of this, with its massive driving wheel enabling it to go at some serious speeds for the time, must have been a real spectacle. And I'm pretty sure back in the day you wouldn't find any Victorian people saying, oh, I think the Great Western locos are a bit monotonous. No, this really must have been something quite spectacular to see. And I think that it's amazing that a model that dates back to the 1960s, just with a bit of modern paintwork, because that's all it is, the detail is exactly the same, can look as marvellous as this does as it runs along. I mean, that decoration job is just incredible. And I've got it running along with a couple of Hornby clerestory coaches, which themselves are quite old, and then the Pullman there, which I've added in just to make up the rake. That's an old Triang Pullman coach as well, from a similar kind of time, maybe a little later than the Dean single. So there you have it, Dean single, a classic example of a very early and very, very elegant Great Western loco. I'm going to stick with the pre-grouping theme for the time being, because I think the Great Western produced some really beautiful pre-grouping designs. And I think one of the most beautiful is the City class, and the most famous and possibly most beautiful of the City class was City of Truro. And here she is. This is a loco from the turn of the century, just after 1900, and again it's a little bit different from your run-of-the-mill Great Western locos. We'll take a look at the livery in just a second, because again I think there's a few variations in this loco which make it stand out from the rest of the Great Western fleet. And while this loco is of course preserved, there's something about the 440 wheel configuration that it has that makes it really stand out, and I just think it's a beautifully proportioned loco. The City class was made up of 20 locos built between 1902 and 1909 to the design of George Jackson Churchwood. The class was immediately recognisable by their Belpaire fireboxes and lack of domes. After their initial production, the class was improved and modified for several years, and eventually they would be fitted with superheaters and several other modifications. The class would be the first Great Western 440 design to feature a tapered boiler, which would eventually become Churchwood's standard number 4 boiler. Truro was reportedly the first loco to exceed 100 miles per hour, and City of Truro, which still exists, is the only member of the class to actually be preserved, and she was last restored in 2004 at a cost of £130,000. So this loco was an easy choice, because obviously it's a significant loco, a very fast loco, particularly given the year that it was produced, and whether or not you believe that this loco was the first to do 100 miles per hour, it's widely agreed that these were very fast locos indeed, and speed is cool and noteworthy, isn't it? Also though, this is a great example of a good Great Western livery. If you're someone who thinks the Great Western liveries are a little bit samey and monotonous, then this is the loco I show to you, because it's got that extra pre-grouping complexity to it that the later locos didn't. And this one in particular is produced by Bachmann, which shows the Great Western livery in a particularly good light. So yeah, look at the beautiful lining on the boiler here. You have got some brass and copperwork on this, the copperwork being real, so that gives you an even better idea what this would have looked like. I do think though the Great Western livery looks better with the sort of deep reddish underframe and chassis rather than the plain black that we would see in later years. I really think this just complements the green and makes it look even more elegant. And look at the front bogie as well, such a complex bogie. You really don't get that many other railways with such a complex livery. And the same is true of the tender. Just look at the complexity here. You've got the lining on the top and all the little picked out details on the bottom. It's just a gorgeous livery. And like I say, I also love the 440 wheel configuration. Looks a little bit better proportioned, I think, than the 460s, and obviously the outside coupling rods also make this loco stand out and look particularly unique. And again, this is a feature that looks even better when the loco is running. So again, let's couple this up to some coaches and let's have this whizzing round at high speed, just like the real city of Truro could. And there's a bit more activity to see on this loco because of course it's not a single wheeler and it's got multiple driving wheels which are coupled up with rods. And this loco really does look excellent at speed. It's just such a gorgeous, gorgeous loco, and you can truly imagine this thing thundering along the line with a train full of very enthralled passengers. This loco for me really is the full package because it looks great, it runs well. It's not dreadfully powerful or anything, but you know, it's a relatively early loco, so it wouldn't have been hauling ridiculous numbers of coaches or anything like that. But it's a good performer, it looks good on the track, that's the main thing. And ultimately it is one of my very favourite Great Western locos of all time. Very few people aren't a fan of City of Truro, and of course she's a real asset to the Great Western as a result. Most people agree that passenger locomotives are more elegant than freight locos, and I guess I would agree with that on the whole, but that's not really true for the Great Western. I'm about to show you a freight loco from the GWR, which is every bit as elegant, I think, as the locos we've just seen. And the loco is this. It comes from 1883, which makes it the oldest loco in today's video, and it is obviously the Dean Goods. An 060 tender engine designed for freight, and this thing is so beautiful that it almost seems a shame that this was relegated to freight duties, but indeed it was, and it must have looked very, very lovely indeed doing it. Also known as the Great Western 2301 class, the Dean Goods was introduced in 1883 to the design of William Dean for goods work on the railway. The class was produced for over 15 years, and in that time 260 of these were built. In 1917, 62 of this number were sent to France by the ROD to aid the war effort. By the end of the war in 1919, most of these had returned to England, where their withdrawal began not long before the Second World War. When the war did finally come, 100 of these engines were modified, painted black, and then brought back into service. By 1957 though, all members of the class had been finally withdrawn and scrapped, with only one example entering preservation. And I think this is just a beautiful example of Great Western locomotive. First of all, because it's so small and dainty. There's no way of looking at this and saying, oh, that's a big ugly beast. No, it's incredibly nicely proportioned, this one. It's made by Oxford Rail, and I don't think the livery is as good as it could have been because the metalwork is not very metallic, it's a bit matte. But if you imagine those parts being high shine, you get a better sense of this. I love the cab as well, which is almost a selfish thing to say because it must have been horrendous to actually work in. But from a visual point of view, it's quite an elegant cab with that lovely curve around the inner wall. I like that very much. And while the livery is certainly not as complex as some of the pre-grouping Great Western passenger liveries, you've still got the beautiful complex lining, of course, and the rich green. And here's a better example of the pre-grouping Great Western tender, or at least one of them. Looks like a very similar tender to the one we saw on the Dean single, except of course this one is produced to more modern standards and there's a bit more detail to it. So an even better example of a Great Western tender. Yeah, I really like this loco, to be honest, and I really think the Great Western's pre-grouping locos are one of their biggest assets because they are particularly gorgeous in their liveries, I think. Anyway, we haven't had any goods running today on the railway, so it's time to get this one down onto the track and do just that. So originally these locos from Oxford were really plagued by dodgy motors, which made them run quite underpoweredly. And Oxford eventually acknowledged this by replacing the motors with better ones, although obviously that didn't help those of us with an original dodgy motored version. So I actually re-engineered this one so that it would have a better coreless motor in it, and now I can enjoy the best performance out of this thing, which is really good because these locos look great as they meander along very gently with short freight trains, which I think is a lovely sight to see. Like I say, those open cabs must have been very cruel. I mean, in the summer, a steam locomotive is going to be very hot and unpleasant regardless of its cab design. But yet in the winter, the cold and the rain and the wet and the snow and everything else that happens in this country in the winter must have made this quite unbearable. But I do like the way the cabs look, at least from the outside. So there you have it, the Dean Goods locomotive. Very, very elegant, even for a freight loco. And of course that is true of a lot of pre-grouping locos too, I suppose. But it's even more true of the Great Western locos, of course, because of their liveries. But all of these locos so far have been pre-grouping. Maybe it's the post-grouping Great Western that people find a bit boring. And it is true that by 1924, the Great Western were producing a lot of 460s. They'd really fallen into the 460 pattern. Fair enough, I guess, but that's not all they produced. They produced different wheel configurations too, of course, and there's none more unique than this. This is a design that emerged in 1934, and it's known as the 7200 class. It was also the largest tank engine ever to run on the Great Western, and I cannot find a larger tank engine than this that ever ran in the UK. I'm not going to say for sure that this is the largest, only that I could not find a larger one. So if you can, please do let me know. But look at this thing. You cannot say that this loco is samey and monotonous because there's literally nothing else to compare it with. There are other similar designs such as the 5200 and whatever, but yeah, a 282 tank engine, good luck finding very many of those. The GWR 7200 class was introduced in 1934 to the design of Charles Collett for heavy freight work. They were unusual in that they were the only 282 tank engines ever to be built and used by a British railway. The class was a product of a rebuild of the earlier 4200 and 5205 class, which were originally 280 locomotives. Part of their rebuild involved the extension of their coal bunkers, which necessitated the addition of the extra trailing wheel set to support the extra weight. In total, 54 existing engines were rebuilt into the 72XX design between 1934 and 1939. The class was powerful and successful, although their unprecedented length did get them banned from some goods yards. Withdrawal of the class began in 1962, with the final examples surviving in operation until 1965. Today, all but 3 have been scrapped. And this design is the complete opposite of the Dean Goods, which was very small and dainty. This thing though is a massive beast, and while some people do like their little dainty locos, others of course do enjoy the monsters, and this one really is a monster. So this is here just to show that the Great Western have you covered if that's what you prefer as well. And look at this thing. This is a big chunky loco, not designed for elegance by any stretch of the imagination. Plain livery this time, unlined, nothing like that. This thing was not designed to mess around entertaining people, even though it does because of how massive it is. No, this thing was designed to do a job and to do it with ease by the looks of things. And sure enough, being one of the UK's very largest ever tank engines, it really is a sight to behold, isn't it? The sheer length of this loco is absolutely mind-blowing. And in a way, the model is even more impressive because it's designed to run on tight model railway curves. Yeah, this thing is still compatible with second radius, which is no mean feat really, is it, given the wheelbase? In a way, I'm not a massive fan of this model because I think it was produced quite cheaply and the level of detail is pretty much dialed back a little bit. But in terms of the shape and the proportions, the model does a great job of putting across what an odd and also impressive machine this would be. And yet again, that is even easier to see when this loco is running. So for the second time, let's get another freight train going. This time, let's make it even longer for the massive 72XX. I was always a little bit disappointed in the 72XX as a model because despite its massive size, it's really not that heavy. Quite a plasticky body on this one. So it's not a massive hauler. However, on a reasonably flat layout, it is capable of hauling a decent length freight train, as you can see here. And you know, a couple of them, maybe a double header, or maybe this paired with a 52 or a 42 loco. Yeah, it's going to be much better, almost unstoppable really, I would say. But a very impressive beast to see run, nevertheless. Nice smooth runner from Hornby, geared to run nice and slowly. So it really helps you to imagine what these beasts must have been like back when they were running on the Great Western with the big freight trains. Of course, you can still see them around today, but you know, hauling passengers on a heritage railway, not quite the same as hauling massive freight trains around the country doing serious work. But that's why these models are so good, because they help you to imagine what it must have been like. And of course, you can put these scenes together in miniature to see them for yourself. So there you go, the 72XX, one of the very largest Great Western locos ever to exist, and the largest Great Western tank engine. The Great Western's freight engines didn't stop with the 8-coupled tank engines though. They also produced some very lovely tender locos for freight, such as this design from 1903, which is a 280 tender loco known as the 2800 class. And we've actually got a new model of this loco coming out pretty soon from Dapol. This obviously is not that. This is a relatively modern Hornby example from the last couple of decades. And though I'm sure the Dapol version will be much better than this, and it will be an improvement in terms of features, this loco is still fantastic to look at. It's still got a lot of lovely details, and I think it still does a fair job of capturing the prototype. The Great Western 2800 or 28XX was a class of 2-cylinder 280 steam locos designed by George Jackson Churchward. Designed for heavy freight, these locos could output a tractive effort of up to 160 kilonewtons, although at a much slower speed than some engines owing to the small diameter of their driving wheels. In fact, this would be Britain's first 280 locomotive. The first example was built in 1903 as a prototype, which was subsequently improved upon for the main run of a further 83 engines a couple of years later in 1905. Withdrawal wouldn't take place until 1958, so they were a very long-serving class, and a healthy 6 examples do remain today under preservation. And although this is still a massive beefy machine like the 72XX was, I think this loco retains a bit more of the Great Western's elegance. This is a pre-grouping design, technically speaking, and I think that does show through in the design. Obviously, I think the fact that this is in a green helps as well. It's a little bit more interesting than just the black. And even though it's not got any lining on it, I still find myself really enjoying the look of this thing. I think it's simple, it's no frills, but it still manages to catch the eye. And if you look at the loco itself, it's still incredibly long, isn't it? And when you think of the other pre-grouping locos that were out there, the Achilles class, for instance, the Dean Goods, and then this thing, this must have been an absolutely mind-blowing loco when it was first brought out, just after the turn of the century. And this model from Hornby is absolutely beautiful. You've got the valve gear between the frames, a very, very detailed cab, and lots of other details and features as well, which make this loco a really lovely one to own. And this loco really goes to show just what variety there was in the Great Western freight locomotive. You've got the behemoths like this and the 72XX, and then you've also got the tiny nimble locos such as the Dean Goods. And there's pretty much everything in between if you look for it as well. So many classes of loco that I'm not showing in this video that would be worthy of a mention. The Mogul is another one. Great mixed traffic locos, those. Anyway, let's get this down onto the track and let's see it haul some wagons. So this loco is actually much heavier than the 72XX, and I thought I would demonstrate that by putting the two previous freight trains together into one big one. And as you can see, the Hornby 2800 can handle this with ease. Look at that, up Gordon's Hill, massive rake of wagons. So really, in model form, this loco is much better able to demonstrate its real-life counterpart's haulage than the 72, because, yeah, look at this, absolutely fine. Beautiful, beautiful loco this. I have to say I do prefer this because it's in the green. Because yeah, the blacks can be quite plain and ordinary, can't they? And even though this has got no lining on it and it's still very simple in terms of decoration, I think it's just that little bit more interesting in the green because it's got the contrast between the green and the black sections. And frankly, I think it's just a slightly nicer colour, if anything. So yeah, a freight loco in a slightly more interesting livery than usual. And more crucially than that, not a 460. Even though the upper body does kind of look a lot like a manor or a hall or something like that. But no, it isn't. It is a 280, and so it well deserves a place in today's video. Finally then, I'm going to finish off with the most famous type of Great Western locomotive besides the 460 tender engine. And of course, that would be the Pannier tank. And I'm finishing with this, the final ever Pannier tank built by the Great Western. In fact, that's just it. It wasn't even built by the Great Western. Designed by them, built by British Railways. The Great Western Pannier tank was very numerous, of course, lots of different classes of Pannier tank, and the Pannier tank really became a staple of the Great Western. So, I don't know, maybe you find Pannier tanks monotonous, but I think they're a little bit more interesting than the 460s, and because there were so many different designs of Pannier tank, you had quite a lot of different looking engines as a result. I mean, the 94XX, for instance, looks nothing like the 16XX that I've got here, so a good variety of Pannier tanks. Let's hear a bit more about this one though. The Great Western 1600 class was actually not Great Western at all, like I've been saying. The design of course was, but all 70 were actually built by British Railways between 1949 and 1955. The design did date back to the 2021 class though, which was a George Armstrong design from 1897. And yet the design held up pretty well 80 odd years later. Because they were introduced to British Railways, the class actually missed out on the lovely Great Western liveries, and they were only painted black initially. We actually had to wait until the preservation era to see this class in a green. And it was actually this example that would be painted green. It was the preserved member of the class, number 1638, and that did indeed get painted into Great Western green. The 1600s were handy locomotives with a tractive effort of 82 kilonewtons and a power classification of 2F. A mere 10 years after their introduction, withdrawals began. By 1966, the final member of the class was withdrawn, meaning that no 16XX ever served for more than 15 years in actual service. Today, only one example remains, and this one is owned by the Kent and East Sussex Railway. And as one of the very final Great Western designs, I thought it would be quite worthwhile to include this one. And even though it wasn't built by the Great Western, I think it's still a pretty good representation of your typical Great Western Pannier tank, with the flat top and all of the detail up there, such as the domes and the water filler caps, and your unlined Great Western green, which is how a lot of the Pannier tanks would have looked back in the day, even though this one obviously would be in a BR black livery. And like I say, the Pannier tank is very much the property of the Great Western. I can't actually think of a single other Pannier tank design that was not owned by the Great Western. If you can, please pop it down in the comments, particularly if it's from Britain. Maybe there are others elsewhere. But this is a particularly good example of a Pannier tank in terms of the model because it's so heavy. It's made almost entirely of metal. It's produced by Rapido, who are pretty good for that sort of thing, which makes it an incredibly weighty loco, feels very realistic in the hands. And as you can see, the level of detail is nothing short of tremendous too, which also helps to sell that illusion. So it's a beautiful model, also a very good runner as well. So let's get this down onto the track and let's demonstrate one of the last ever Great Western designs in action. Out in the wild, you would find Pannier tanks doing a bit of both passenger and freight work, but since this particular Pannier tank is a preserved example, I thought it's most likely going to be doing passenger work these days. So it's got a few passenger coaches, and as you can see, she's handling those with ease. But I do love a good Pannier tank, particularly one that runs as well as this one does. So good runner, great level of detail on this one. That makes it a really good example of a Pannier tank. So there you have it. You have seen all 6 of my locos for today. All of them very different, and I've really done my best to include the biggest possible variety in today's locos. So which one was your favourite? Please do comment down below and let me know. For me, I think it would have to be the City class. Yeah, City of Truro, because it's the full package. It runs great, the level of detail's marvellous, the shape and character that the loco has is just unrivaled, and of course that livery is absolutely fantastic. Having said that, I think if there was a proper modern version of the Dean single out there, then that would be my favourite. I think in real life, that one's probably my favourite of the ones I've shown today, because I'm a huge fan of single wheelers and also pre-grouping. So, did I succeed? Do you still think the Great Western locos were boring? I really think they had a great variety in their locos. If you look beyond the sort of million Pannier tanks and 460 designs, there's a lot of different stuff to see, and most of it is very elegant and beautiful. Let me know what you think though. Did you think that the Great Western locos were boring, or have you liked them from the beginning and you've just enjoyed the Great Western worship fest that I've done today? Please do let me know what you think. For now though, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you very, very soon for another video. Alright, cheers everybody, you take care.